on the Vincent, we had a patient that was critical and was 600 miles from Okinawa. Took off and flew at airplane speeds with that patient right to the landing pad at Okinawa in Camp Foster. That golden hour of patient care is extremely important.
Hello and welcome to the Fighter Pilot Podcast. I am your host, Vincent Aiello, Callsign Jello, and joining me today in the Circle Air Group studios here at Gillespie Field in San Diego, California, is U.S. Navy Captain Sam Bryant, Callsign Flesh. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's good to have you. Now, you are the wing commander for all CMV-22s, in the Navy?
Yes, that's true. So the VRM, the Fleet Logistics Multi-Mission Wing, owns squadrons east, west, and eventually here in Japan, and we'll be in charge of logistics worldwide for U.S. Navy strike groups.
Okay, but you are here in San Diego. In fact,
Correct.
We're practically neighbors. Awesome. Well, tell us how you got there. Where are you from, and what was your military path leading up to it?
So I'm originally from upstate New York, Ithaca, New York, home of Cornell University and Ithaca College. I went to the Naval Academy by way of the Naval Academy Prep School, and then selected aviation out of there and got my wings. And then I became a C-2A Greyhound pilot, VRC world, and I was a C-2 pilot east, west, and Japan, so I had experience all around the world flying C-2s. Eventually became a CO of VRC-30 here in San Diego, where I learned to love Southern California. And then after my squadron command tour, I went to the Pentagon, where I was the requirements officer for CMV-22 as we were procuring the aircraft for the Navy, as well as the legacy C-2 Greyhound for sustainment. For my sins at the Pentagon, they sent me to lead the transition for the CMV-22. We started that with the Marines, actually, down in New River, North Carolina. So I surprised my wife with a 2-year trip to North Carolina, which wasn't on our radar at the time. And then we helped set up the community here in San Diego for standing up our wing in our first squadron, which is VRM-30. And then from there, fleeted up from deputy to Commodore, which I'm doing now. And we have now 3 squadrons stood up within the Navy, and soon a detachment moving to Japan.
Okay. And you get a chance to fly the Osprey.
Absolutely, yeah. So I've been flying the Osprey really since 2019, the MV version, and then transitioned to the CMV version. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty neat to get to fly a brand new aircraft in my this late in my career.
Yeah, I bet.
So
how many hours in the Greyhound?
So in the Greyhound, about 3,000 hours.
Wow. Okay. And how many in the Osprey?
So in the Osprey, I've got just under 200.
Okay. So all right. Good. Well, and you probably don't want to steal too many hours from the younger folks that are out there doing it.
Right, right. Yeah, so as we're standing up, we took our first aircraft delivery back in June of 2020. So during that time, we had to limit the flight hours of the senior folks and let the junior folks get their quals.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, here on the Fighter Pilot Podcast, about 100 episodes ago, we had a Marine gentleman on the show to talk about mainly the MV-22, but he did opine on the CV-22 a little bit. Mm-hmm. So we are a little bit familiar with the aircraft, but he wasn't totally sure. I guess there was going to be some more fuel capability. There's going to be some maybe other differences. So talk to us. Let's talk first off about the aircraft. What's different about the CMV-22 compared to maybe its sibling?
So one thing that you'll notice, I brought the model here, but the one thing you'll notice with the difference with the different type model series, first off, is the paint. The CV, the AVSOC, Air Force Special Operations Aircraft, is painted a very cool, black and gray, and the Marines are a gray model, whereas the Navy went with a white and gray poly paint to identify it as a logistics aircraft and not a warfighting aircraft initially. Okay. So that's one of the first differences. Then the really obvious difference when you walk up to the front of the aircraft is we have a larger fuel bladder in the sponson tanks along the fuselage, and then we also added fuel in the wing tanks as well as put a tank in the empennage. And that gave us a significant amount more gas than the CV and the MV. While all 3 air variants can refuel in the air, we can go 1,150 miles unrefueled, which is significantly further than the MVs. So whereas MV would launch with around, just under 12,000 pounds of gas, we're launching with 17,500 pounds of gas, and it's pretty impressive.
Okay.
So, and then on top of that, we have some modifications to our comm systems that made us for global navigation. The HF antenna is something the Marines don't have, that the Air Force and the Japanese actually variant also now have. And then coming soon to a theater near us, we have a lot of upgrades to the carrier interoperability systems, such as Link 16, moving onto the airplane, which is a huge improvement for a logistics aircraft to be able to play in that environment.
And that is, I think, what we could spend most of our discussion on today is it's not just a new airplane to the Navy, but it's really bringing a whole new mission compared to what the C-2 could do. But before we get to that, so the paint, as you said, right, similar to like an E-2 or a C-2. So a little higher gloss. I'm told that's, I think, a little easier to maintain as far as corrosion goes, but we don't have to necessarily drop anchor on that. But to your point, the MV-22 is more like an F-18. So kind of that dull haze gray for their mission, and that makes more sense to them. Now, as we get to the mission in a moment, is there any discussion happening though, as far as, right, you might not just be logistics forever. So
right. Well, I think the most obvious expansion that we could be doing right off the bat is actually expanding what we do with logistics. Right now, we're going to and from the carrier, just like the C-2. However, this recent Rim of the Pacific exercise we did a lot of logistics to and from the L-class ships. And so that's an obvious expansion that we could do as naval aviation is looking to leverage additional flat tops for aviation missions.
When you say L-class, you mean like the amphibious ships, so LHDs, LHAs,
yes.
LPD?
LPD, correct,
okay.
yeah. Yep. So those are all different ships to land on, and from an aviator perspective, it's neat to try to land on some of those different ships. It's actually pretty challenging. Get a lot of respect for the rotary community and what they do. Which
you didn't have that choice in a COD, or a C-2, I should say. You had the field that you were operating out of, and then the ship.
Correct. Yeah. Now we can even go to landing pads and things like that, which is pretty impressive.
Right.
We've already exercised some of that in the theater. So
okay. So practically speaking, the CMV-22 has had what? I mean, as you and I are recording this towards the end of September, is it on its second deployment now?
Yeah, so we just got back from our second deployment with Abe Lincoln. The first one was on Carl Vinson.
Right, the Air Wing of the Future, I think.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. So the full Air Wing of the Future will include MQ-25, but the additional F-35 and CMV and the additional Growler on board and that sort of thing, and E-2D as well is a big part of all the Air Wing of the Future complement.
Yeah, so just one for one, if you will, as far as a replacement, and maybe that's not even a fair way to put it, but for it doing what the C-2 used to do, what did we learn from those first couple of deployments?
So we learned a lot of things. I would say that there are some limitations to every new airframe as a compromise. As I learned watching different platforms transition, the F-18 was a compromise from the Tomcat.
Sure.
I'm sure there's a lot of people that want to comment on that. The Growler was a compromise from some of the things that even the Prowler did very well. But what we learned is that the CMV is not just a one-trick pony. It can do a lot of things that the C-2 was not as suited to do. One thing that I was really surprised with is how much it was used as a medevac platform. So the C-2 required a cat shot if somebody needed to be medevaced from the carrier, and sometimes if somebody's extremely injured or there's an injury that doesn't allow for a cat shot, which is a pretty violent evolution, they had to be heloed off. Well, that only works if you're within helo range. So right away on the Vinson, we had a patient that was critical and was 600 miles from Okinawa, and we launched to go get that patient, right around the sunset time, and landed and took off and flew at airplane speeds with that patient right to the landing pad at Okinawa in Camp Foster. And there was to the waiting hands of critical care. We couldn't have done that with the C-2. The best we could have asked for was if that patient could have taken a cat shot, which they couldn't, we still would have had to land at Kadena and ambulance them over to Camp Foster. So that golden hour of patient care is extremely important.
Yeah, and you would have had to also do that, I think, in the daytime, right? Wasn't the COD limited to?
Absolutely. Yeah. So now our pilots fly with NVGs, or we have an NVG compliant cockpit and cabin. And that's a whole new world. That was a whole new world for me. I'd say when people ask what was the hardest thing with transition, it was like putting on goggles and flying around at 250 knots at 200 feet, and you're like, what are we doing down here? At that when it's dark out. But it's pretty impressive. I will say it does create from my previous night experience in the C2. I'm one of the dinosaurs that flew the C2 at night of the ship. It's kind of cheating when you put on the night vision goggles and fly around the boat at night, but it's a great capability.
Yeah.
So
okay. So as far as the day-to-day stuff, though, moving people, parts, whatever it was you were moving back and forth, was it very comparable, the Osprey to the Greyhound, as far as just the regular kind of vanilla COD mission?
So the vanilla COD mission, I will say the C2 does that like no other aircraft. It was really specialized for that, and that's what it's really good at. The CMV was a compromise in terms of when you mix passengers with their baggage and the way that we load the aircraft. The CMV is faster at loading and unloading than the C2, but we take a hit as far as overall volume from a C2.
Okay.
So the carriers did have to adjust. Wasn't so much of an issue with Carl Vinson because we had COVID and we weren't moving as many passengers, but it became a little bit more of an issue with Abe Lincoln as COVID started relaxing and we went into Rim of the Pacific, which we lovingly like to refer to it as DV warfare, because we fly out everybody from
DV being distinguished visitor. So everybody wants to come out and see the ship, and of course now they don't get the cat in the trap that the C2 used to get.
That is true, but I have heard, and I'm obviously biased towards the new platform, but I've heard that people really enjoy the acceleration of the CMV when we roll down and go fast. It's actually a pretty impressive acceleration.
Sure.
So that still interests people, and getting to fly in a revolutionary airframe like this is pretty cool.
Oh, I bet. All right. So then you talked about a compromise. So maybe there is one thing on a one-for-one basis, it's not as good as what it's replacing, but we are making this decision because now it does all these other things.
Correct.
Right? So let's talk about that. What other things now I don't even know how to put it, but the CMV-22 community, or that debt, or whatever used to be C2, but now it's CMV-22. What else can they do that a couple of years ago when I was deploying, they couldn't?
Yeah, so one of the big things and one of the reasons that we linked this airframe with the F-35 deployment is we can move the F-35 power module, which is a critical capability. We can't always pull into port, can't always pull into Hong Kong and get a new engine. And the power module is so heavy, you can't unwrap it with high lines between
underway
ships.
Replenishment.
Yes. Yep. So sorry.
That's all right. That's why I'm here.
Acronyms. So you can use a Super Puma helicopter, to vertically replenish, vert rep the engine, but that requires you to be fairly close to the ship. So our ability to take a power module at range out to the ship is a neat capability, and we did that during our operational test and did that proof of concept.
Okay.
With logistics for everybody being a challenge, supply chains, whether it's Amazon or jet engines, sometimes you're constrained and you might need that just-in-time capability to get an F-35 ready to go into the mission. So we were able to do that. It's definitely a time-intensive evolution, but we proved we could do it.
Yeah. Okay. So logistics-wise, it has the ability to do the F-35. What about beyond logistics? I mean, I guess the C2 probably could have had SEALs jump out the back on their way somewhere. I don't know if that was ever done, and you can comment if you'd like, but I feel like the CMV now can bring, or the Osprey, I don't know how to abbreviate it, but for simplicity, gosh, I feel like it could do long-range search and rescue. It could do SEAL stuff. I mean, so what else is it doing? So
we could theoretically do everything that that the Marines are doing with the plane.
Okay.
And those other mission sets, our core mission sets, we would probably not expand into inserting troops in combat unless we had a significantly larger force structure to support that kind of.
As far as number of aircraft?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So, plus that's not a pickup game, so it would increase. I'd have to change my training continuum to handle those kind of missions. Combat support missions. However, SAR, especially in the SAR assist or even surface search, we could expand into that stuff pretty easily without a lot of changes to how we do things. SAR, the aircraft does actually have a hoist that we could use, albeit you'd have to hover much higher. Our air crew would have to train differently. We don't have SAR swimmers builded with our squadron, so we'd have to find a way to co-opt those from a helicopter squadron if we were going to do that. But in the SAR assist mode, I could go out and find a survivor, perhaps kick a raft out, at least if they're ambulatory, for that. If a F-35 was to be out of helicopter range and a pilot was down, we could go out and locate that. The aircraft has the ability to run search patterns, and we could find the survivor, locate them, hopefully get them what they need to survive a little bit longer until a asset, either a ship or a helicopter, could get close.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I could see that happening in the near future. And then if we were going to do actual recovery, like the Air Force does, that would require some more training in different TTP training tactics and procedures.
Is there someone probably who is looking at all these things? You guys probably have conferences or meetings.
We do, yeah. So the Naval Air Warfare Development Center, and this is something that's really been good to see, different from when I was in the VRC world. We didn't have a whole lot of integration with Nautic up in Fallon. I would say like zero, and even the air wing integration was limited. Now with the CMV, we have been welcomed into the discussion with the air wing and the Naval Air Warfare Development Center in the realm of what will we do in a contested logistics scenario where our logistics are challenged, which is something we really haven't had to look at as a nation in a long time, really since World War II. Yeah.
You talked earlier about replenishment, which is always a big deal for ships at sea, whether it's fuel or bullets or food or whatever. Do you see that becoming part of the role of, we're going to help when two ships are next to each other, going over and slinging maybe loads back and forth?
We could do that. The CMV and the V-22 in general is not an ideal vertical replenishment vert rep platform due to the downwash and the stress that it puts on the airframe. It can do it, but it's sort of a Swiss Army knife. It's not the honed special blade to do that mission. We prefer to do that with our H-60. So I see the H-60 role sticking with that. And then for us, we could be taking the things long range to, say, a submarine or to a independent deployer in a distributed maritime model, and lowering something down via a speed bag or something like that, like a critical part that they needed for a ship's radar, or in the case of a submarine, some other part that they needed to do their mission. So we could be doing that, and there have been some proof of concepts that I think floating around the internet. There was an MV picture replenishing a submarine at sea, and that's something we can do.
I suddenly feel, I have to admit, Sam, a little self-conscious, like I'm asking you, oh, it could do this, it could do that. And I'm wondering, is this the kind of thing you guys are fending off quite often, as far as maybe Congress or different agencies are like, oh, now that you have this capability, you should be doing all these things. And right, you maybe as a community are, well, we need money to train to that, because like you just said, inserting troops sounds to me, right, maybe if I can play the other side of this, just go land and people get out the back and take off. Well, not necessarily, right? You could be getting shot at. There could be threats and surface to air, shoulder fired, and this, that, and the other, and you don't want to just go into those. So do you find yourselves having to kind of defend, if you will, the community as far as we don't want to do all these things, or if we're going to do them, we need the resources to do them?
That's really my message is, if I was going to do mission expansion, one, we need to do that very deliberately. You can't just suddenly expand the mission, drastically. And then the force structure is super important. You need the aircraft, you need the people that are trained, you need the pilots, you need the training tactics and procedures that are nested in the, in the Nautic curriculums. I need people up at Nautic that are part of the VRM community to be the subject matter experts. You were up there at Top Gun and Nautic, and that's not a pickup game. And if you're not there regularly, you quickly lose your currency and your relevancy in the fight. Even just flying around, in that environment, if you were to have a SAR effort in Fallon, I would only really want the Fallon helicopter guys that are trained to fly in that mountain environment coming to get me, because they know how to do that and they train to it. You couldn't just go get any 60 squadron from North Island and go do that. So
yeah, and yet I feel like the Navy particularly, but really all the military branches, I'm sure, always have this can-do attitude, right? Like, give us a mission, we can do it. And that's great, but the drawback of that is, well, you do put yourselves and your forces at risk a little bit. And okay, then did you just essentially sign yourself up for more because you just proved you can do it? And I always tell people, I don't know if you're familiar with that guy, Aaron Ralston. Remember, he got stuck in the canyon in Utah.
Yeah.
Like, okay, what he did was he survived for 5 days, then he cut off his own arm and rappelled down 70 feet and made it like, okay, that shouldn't be the standard. That's like Herculean. And yet sometimes I think people look at the kinds of things your community and others can do and say, oh, well, we should be able to do that all the time. Like, no, they write books and make movies about this because it should be rare.
Absolutely. Even just the pure logistics mission that we're doing right now, we only have 2 deployments under our belt. So I'm continually reminding our folks that we're not the pros from Dover yet. We've had a couple really good touchdown passes. Now it's time to really hone some of the blocking and tackling of that mission. And then as we look to expand with some of the logistics missions, I think we can continue to get better at that. And then if we were looking to expand into other entirely different critical mission sets, such as surface search, SAR, things like that, we would start needing to have the full gamut of training and evaluation and equipment to do that.
And not just the training I would submit, right? It's also, if I've got aircraft doing that, they're not doing something else.
Exactly.
So I might need more aircraft, or I might need more people, because an aircraft can fly almost through the day, just got to service it, but pilots need rest.
Yeah, well, that, and if I was doing SAR on a boat, on a carrier, CAG would want my aircraft to be sitting there on alert.
Right.
So I'm not off doing logistics somewhere. Yeah. And if I was even standing a shore alert, that aircraft couldn't be broken into for maintenance or other things. So it's a dedicated asset. It's really basically fenced off during the time frame that you're in that window. So it's a significant commitment.
So how many CMV-22s were on Carl Vinson and Abraham Lincoln?
3. So we deploy with 3, and that's another big difference that from the C2 to the CMV. It takes 3 CMVs to do what the C2 did with 2 aircraft. And the reason for that is the maintenance takes a lot longer. So that's another thing we learned, is that although we've done a lot of accelerated learning from the Marines that we did for deploying with the Marines in New River and learning how they do maintenance, our phase maintenance, which is our planned maintenance cycles, take anywhere from 10 to 15 days. So during that time, the aircraft's down for maintenance, and the other 2 aircraft have to pick up the load. So we're in a model where we have 3 to make 2. The C2s were strained in their model because they were really 2 to make 2. And a lot of times, really, the metric is 2 to make 1.5, if that makes sense. That's how the military does its calculations. Right. Try flying half an aircraft. But generally, each carrier is allotted 1.5 logistics missions a day as the metric for theater security operations. So that's kind of what we built the model for the CMV around, and it's 3 to make 2. Is
there a discussion about 4 at some point? And if we have this mission creep, they might need more aircraft.
Well, when I was a skipper of VRC-30, we did a fleet battle experiment, actually on Vinson with the Marines, and they flew out HMX-1. And I asked the Marines, if you had to support a carrier with, for 6 to 7 months, flying around the world, supporting them from shore, what would you do? How would you do it? And they said, I'd take 4 aircraft and probably 180 people. And so we tested that with the FB, the fleet battle experiment, and it worked out. But when I went to the Pentagon and took that knowledge with me, they said, no way, you get 2. And I said, we can't do it with 2. And so, okay, so we agreed on 3. And that's really, that metric has actually proven correct. And we've been able to maintain our sortie completion rates, in the high 90s, which has been impressive and a testament to the professionalism of our pilots and maintainers.
Yeah,
so
all the folks there. Yeah. Well, so you provided me some photographs ahead of time. I want to show a couple here, and let's talk through them. So the first one we have is what appears to be a CMV-22. I don't know if it's taking off or landing. It's probably not taking off.
It's landing, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about day carrier landings. What is it working its way into the Case 1 stack, or what
Absolutely,
is it doing?
Yeah. So we fly during daytime Case 1, we fly like a fixed wing aircraft through most of the pattern, and this is actually an improvement over the C2 in that our pattern airspeed is about 170 knots. Okay. So I can actually integrate with a Hornet in the pattern, and then as you come around off the 180 and through the 90, you're transitioning to tilt rotor mode, and I've got the ability to control my interval as much as I want. I can go as slow as I want to, which is kind of nice. But our average closure when we get in close, we're looking for about 25 knots over the deck, and we're doing we slow it down to about 10 knots of closure and just land on spot 9 right on the fantail there, then we typically taxi forward for loading, offloading, and onloading, and then we do a short takeoff, a stow at 71 degrees nacelle, and do like a deck run essentially, which like World War II in the C1 that used to be actually in the C2 NATOPS, and still like it never was taken out, but you'd never do a deck run unless there was a ship's casualty.
Right. Now
we do them all the time, and that's the difference actually between the CMV and the MV and CV is that we're much heavier. So we typically take off in the short takeoff mode instead of vertical mode when we're fully loaded to provide that power margin and single engine climb away ability.
Okay. And so if you're coming aboard and landing about where this is depicted landing, you're probably coming down last, obviously?
Correct. So instead of breaking the deck and coming down first, we used to kind of be in the tanker pattern, hawking the deck at 1.2, and then right away when we saw the last launch off of Cat 3 or 4, we'd already be in the break and coming around and timing our interval so that we're first on deck and pull off. Now we're up at the top of the stack and following it down, and we come into the break and then land on spot 9, and then we're onloading or offloading and onloading during the reset, and then getting off before the first launch.
Gotcha. Now, how does that change at night? Here we have an image of a CMV-22 on the deck at night.
Yeah, so at night we operate case 3 like everybody else. Okay. Typically at the bottom of the stack for pressurization with passengers. We try not to be up high so that they can breathe.
That's a plus.
That's a plus, yeah. So we're typically at the bottom of the Marshall stack, and the C2 also when it would recover case 3 would typically be on the COD radial, which was 180 relative. So there'd be a Marshall stack for everybody else, and then we're directly behind the ship, and then come in case 3 and push just like everybody else, and,
Gotcha.
and come down the chute. The configuration is a lot later than the C2 because we want to keep our speed up, and then we'll configure, really just inside 2 miles and get dirty and come in.
But are you turning on similar avionics? Maybe you have got an ILS or some other reference?
That's kind of one of the bummers is we don't have the ACLS like the C2, so we're doing CCAs right now. But that the future with the Joint Precision Landing System, we will get that, and that's something that we'll have the ability to theoretically auto land this plane.
Oh, wow. Tell me about these lights that are on the prop rotors, I think Sweet Pea called them.
Yeah, prop rotors.
Is that for formation flying? Is it for safety? I assume they can be turned off. You may not want...
So they're actually a really great, Boeing, similar to the Hornet, put great formation lights on this plane. Something that the C2 did not fly formation in IFR or at night because it had terrible checkpoints. Whereas the CMV, we not only have the lights that you see on the rotors, we have them on the nacelles here, and then there's the strip lights that you're used to seeing in a Hornet, the same ones on the empennage. So it's very easy to pick your checkpoints at night. One other thing about the lights that is pretty cool is you see the solid pattern there, but you can also actually change the pattern of the lights.
Oh.
So if you're flying a formation at night with multiple aircraft, I can look and see based on the pattern, like who's the lead, who's -2, who's -3, and that's a pretty neat thing at night when you're trying to join up. So
now, as far as the takeoff run goes, generally is that only on the landing area, or will you also go off the bow?
Typically just the landing area,
right.
Because again, there's a lot of jets and other things going on either side of the landing area, so it's a clear area where we can short take off. We can take off vertically, but then we're weight limited like the other V-22 platforms.
Okay. And I'm curious, do you use a shooter per se, or are you more like a helicopter?
No, we do. We do, yeah? Actually. They give us the spool up and tell us we're clear to take off. So so that part is still a little bit is still nostalgic.
Yeah. Some leftovers from the C2 days.
Right.
All right. And let's take a look here in the cockpit. There's two of you up here. And
yeah, so that's myself and Feather Campbell flying to Fallon. I was going to get dropped off to talk to Nautic a little bit up there. So going over the Sierra Nevadas, you got to get, going over Tahoe. If you're flying the airways, you got to get up there. above 12K. So we put on the O2 masks, and this aircraft has OBIGs, similar to OBOGs, and it produces its own oxygen mixture that when you're putting your oxygen mask on allows you to do transits at altitude. The Marines, the Air Force, and we, when we're not embarked with passengers, will fly at altitude to get the better fuel range.
And then the folks in the back will just have some that they can walk around with?
They have a walk-around bottle, but they can also hook up to the system.
Okay. If they're done with everything else, they just sit down and hook up to the system at that
Right.
point. How about the actual cockpit itself? As far as I'm sure it's all very modern, mostly glass at this point, all nice hands-on throttle and whatever else. Maybe it's not even throttle. I don't know.
No, it's a throttle. It's
Okay.
actually that's something that was pretty easy with my transition. Is it's a power lever, a very large one with a lot of castle switches and selector switches on it as well, and it. You just have to think about it in two different regimes of flight, and that's the challenge of being a V-22 pilot. So when I'm in airplane mode, it's still faster, slower. Trees get big, trees get small, left, right. But when you're in tilt rotor mode, then when you start using your the thumb wheel to modulate the nacelles, if I'm flying in formation, for instance, in tilt rotor mode, now my closure is actually my thumb. So moving the nacelles forward gives me increased closure. Moving my nacelles slightly back gives me, helps me reduce my closure with my lead. And then adding power actually makes me go increase in altitude. So it's different.
I've not flown a helicopter, but it sounds a little more like that. So
it does, except it's opposite. In fact, some of our helicopter folks that have transitioned, we're always briefing them on what's called callexia, like dyslexia, but with the collective. And so to add power and go up in a helicopter, you pull up on the collective. Well, it's the opposite with a CMV. So you actually push power to increase your altitude. This was actually a problem when I was learning with the Marines initially, because all my LSO training, if somebody yells, Jello power, what's your left hand doing?
Forward.
Yeah. So we're coming in for a tactical approach, and one of the procedures is you go to idle power to slow down at about 3 miles and start slowing down the plane, and the instructor yells power, because he wants me to pull power, and so I go to mill. And he's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Well, you told me." He said power, and he's like, "Oh, I meant, Yeah. So we had to talk through that. And it's like, so things you want to cover in the brief with vernacular, based on what your background is. That's something we've had to work through as a community.
Bet.
Yeah.
Well, you had 3,000 hours, and you didn't tell me how many traps, but I'm sure it was a lot.
Yeah, like 300 something. Yeah.
And you were a landing signal officer, right?
I was. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So squadron qual, but yeah, enjoyed it. I waved with the CAG 3.
All right, so we talked about folks in the back and bags and all that, and one thing I noticed right away is in the C2 you faced backwards,
correct,
which was interesting.
That's to dissipate the shock of the trap. It was definitely interesting during a catapult shot, though.
Oh yeah. Well, they had you lean forward and kind of go into your straps a little bit. How about though? Again, right? DV warfare, you called it. Can you take the same number? I don't know if we talked about that before.
So we take a little less passengers. However, the big challenge we've had is the baggage. So the Marines would typically put the bags in between people, but everybody that flies on a Marine MV-22 has done water survival. A lot of the grunts that fly with them, the ground troops, have done some sort of water survival in the pool with all their packs. So when we're taking out distinguished visitors in the Navy and and regular people coming to and from the carrier, they're not typically water survival trained. Right. So we've come up with some other systems to transport passengers and cargo at the same time, and bags as well, and they're called a joint mobility container. And what we do with that is it slides in and ties down to the deck, and we throw the bags in that. So
gotcha.
It decreases our seats a little bit.
Okay. But not everybody who starts off inside ends up inside, right? So again, we talked about this. You could, even with the C2, you could lower the ramp in flight and theoretically send people out. In fact, you've done that for football games. And
yeah, I've jumped out of a C2 with the leapfrogs. It's pretty cool.
There you go.
Yeah.
But again, so we could theoretically take a squad, or I don't know what they would call themselves, but of special forces people and let them get where they're going. Yeah,
so we actually train with the SEALs a fair amount, and I was actually surprised about this. I always thought, with the layman's terms, big prop rotor versus the smaller C2 rotor or prop arc, I thought that they would find they would have a lot more trouble jumping out of it. But actually, they prefer jumping out of the V-22 over the C-2. One, the cabin is much taller, so they don't have to hunch over. They can stand up and do all their checks and walk to the ramp. But when they jump out, the airflow is extremely smooth in airplane mode, and they prefer it.
Okay. And then you talked earlier as well about the CASEVAC, casualty evacuation, I suppose. And so what, we can roll folks on straight on their gurneys, tie them down, and they're not getting that violent shot that, again, for someone who's in bad condition, that could be an issue.
Yeah, and even some of the modern medicine stuff that's going on now with aviation and en route care, we can hook the en route care monitors up to the aircraft's communications and theoretically transmit patient vital statistics onto the follow-on care so that they know what's going on. They can start monitoring the patient en route. This picture is actually kind of interesting because this is on the HMS Queen Elizabeth, and we actually did during the Vincent deployment some international cooperation missions where we flew to Queen Elizabeth, and that's another thing that the C-2 can't do because Queen Elizabeth is one of the ramp carriers, and with F-35 and helicopters, and they particularly like the CMV option because their carriers are limited by a helicopter range for any of their logistics or medevac, whereas we can come aboard and help them out. So that's another mission expansion, especially when you're looking at with near-peer competitors, is we're going to rely a lot on our international partners. So our ability to have interoperability with those international partners, most of which do not have nuclear powered aircraft carriers, I think is going to be a really big plus for us.
Yeah. Just a side note for the pilots in something like this. So there's so many different ships. Do they each have somewhat of a standardized light system that you can use? Or have you just been trained, hey, we know that at a certain angle, things look a certain way, we'll just take it slow? I mean...
So we actually have to train specific to the ship class usually. And so we have charts in our pocket checklist that show us the wind envelopes for every ship that we're clear to land on. And our simulator is another thing that's really great about having a new program. Our simulator is state-of-the-art, and we can put a LPD or a CVN or whatever ship we want. It has the appropriate lighting and landing area, so you can practice on the difference between landing on an LPD versus a CVN. It's pretty challenging. It gave me a lot of respect for a whole new world of helicopter black magic that I didn't even know existed. It's pretty challenging. We talk a lot about in the tailhook community of landing on a CVN at night. Pitching smaller ship at night, trying to put it on a very small spot is also pretty scary.
I can imagine. All right. And then we have a photograph of, looks to me like an engine, but I think you called this, what, the unit or something?
Yeah, so it's a F-35 power module.
Module.
Yeah, so the engine itself is huge. It wouldn't fit in any of the Navy aircraft that land on a ship. You have to put it in like a C-130 or something.
Including a C-2?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It would not fit in a C-2.
Okay.
This would not fit in a C-2. It's too tall.
Oh, wow.
And and the weight also is pretty significant. Each one of these engines is about 8,000 pounds, so 7,500 pounds or so. And so the ability of the CMV to get this even in the plane and then fly it out to a ship, it was a significant victory for Navy. Yeah.
And is this specific to the F-35C, or can you also, I mean, here it is shown inside now, but could you also go help the amphib folks? I mean, I assume they have spares on, but...
Yeah, the very first one that was ever flown was actually to an amphib by an MV.
For an F-35B?
Yes.
Huh.
So the power modules are pretty similar. There's definitely some specificity to each TMS, but we can haul it all.
All right. Well, I have some listener questions that are from our Patreon supporters. These are folks that support the show financially, so they get a perk where I tell them I've got an interview lined up with someone like you, and so they ask them. The first is from Jake Clark, and some of these we might have already handled, but at any rate, Jake wants to know, the CMV-22 can obviously function in many ways the C-2 cannot. Does the Navy plan to use it more of a multi-mission role instead of purely COD? Will it maybe take on some of the MH-60's mission? And again, we've kind of talked around this, but that last point I think is an interesting one. Yep. You made a case earlier for, no, we need to keep a lot of 60s on at least a carrier, I assume. So do you see it threatening, if you will, any of the Seahawk missions at all?
Well, thanks for your question, Jake. What I would say is that I don't see it threatening the MH-60 mission.
And that's my word, not Jake's.
But I would say that Yeah, there has been talk of mission expansion in the realm of submarine warfare. And so the Marines have done some work with, carrying torpedoes and sonobuoys and that sort of thing, just to see proof of concept. So the aircraft could do all that. It's just, again, I would need the ability to have enough aircraft and the pilots trained and the systems on board to do that mission well. Because, I mean, the MH-60 is a Death Star. It's got a lot of great systems that make that that protect the carrier and also prosecute subsurface contacts. And really, no other aircraft in the inventory does it like that. So, we would be a poor substitute at best for a lot of what it does. So as far as the rest of the mission expansion that the 60 does, though, I think we could definitely take some things to 11 that the 60 does well, but just doesn't have the range. So again, with SAR efforts that are out of a helicopter range, logistics efforts that are out of helicopter range, medevac. Even theoretically, combat search and rescue might be something that we could look into. However, that is a whole specifically is a whole new kettle of fish that AVSOC spends lifetimes training to.
Right.
It's not something you just go do.
Right, and you made that point now many times, right? I need the dedicated training, which means I also need the tactics and procedures to train to. I need the people to do it. I need the money to do it. I mean, all these things cost money, and I need the aircraft. So it's not just something we're going to snap our fingers and go do.
And that's kind of what people say. What does a Commodore do exactly? What is it you do here? And that's a fair question. But really, what I do is I provide the right people for a job, and then I train them so they have the right training, and then make sure the equipment is ready to go, and everything comes up on step for the deployment. So if we expand the mission, I'm advocating for the warfighter, the CAGs, or the strike group commanders or expeditionary strike group commanders to have what they need to deploy effectively. So it's challenging.
Yep. All right, before I get to the next question, I don't know if your microphone's picking it up or not, but one of the issues with having, of course, an aviation-themed podcast at a studio at an FBO is you get some aircraft noise outside the window. So.
I barely even hear it, and it's always in my background.
No, that's true for you, for sure. All right, so Gundog4314 says the Marines needed more maintenance folks when they switched from the CH-46 to the MV-22. Will Navy squadron debts personnel requirements be larger or smaller? So compared to the detachment right before, let's say, the Carl Vinson, and then the Carl Vinson detachment, how was the size of the folks involved? We talked about the number of aircraft. What about the number of people?
So it's a lot more, actually. So a typical C2 detachment is 2 aircraft and around 45 to 50 people to support that detachment. And for the CMV detachment, we're 3 aircraft and about 86 people. We sent a few more people in the initial detachments to get cross-training and that sort of thing, but it's about 86 people. So it's significantly larger, and by extension, the squadrons are significantly larger. So, my fleet squadron, VRM 30 on the West Coast, that skipper's got a lot of responsibility. He's going to have, just north of 500 people, which is a pretty big squadron.
Yeah. Will a lot of the people, those 80 some odd you said, be ashore? Because in the old days, right, the C2, most of the folks moved to the shore and kind of leapfrogged, or maybe that's not the right word, but lily-padded it out to the carrier and back.
Yeah.
Are a lot of people shore or on the ship? Because there's only so much berthing on the ship.
Right. So most of the people are flown ahead and off the ship. So we'll use our NALO strategic lift or commercial air to fly most of the detachment ahead for an advanced det to the next logistics site. And then we keep a small group on board. And sometimes when we finally already get across the Pacific, we'll move from logistics site to logistics site and not even come aboard the ship. So,
Gotcha.
But we do have a maintenance detachment, and this is because we're in what's called an orphan airframe. We're the only airframe similar on the ship. So we have 15 people on board at all times that are a maintenance det that handle all the troubleshooting, launch and recovery, and safer flight duties on board the ship. We used to lean on the VAW squadron as a C2 community a lot more. Than we only had about 8 people on board, so now we have 15.
Gotcha. All right, so the next question is from Jevin, who says, would emergency procedures for engine failure in a hover be different at the boat compared to over land?
Not really. I mean, it's really the same procedure. The difference with the ship is you're going to have relative wind, which is actually going to help you a little bit more because the carrier is moving through the water. So that would actually help give us a little more cushion at the boat.
Yeah.
So than at the land.
Yeah. Well, or the just natural wind over the ocean is good enough. But either way, we've got some wind. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Robert Douglas Miller says, same cargo space, parentheses, weight and persons, etc., speed, fuel, distance, and what about training pilots from C2 to MV-22? So I'm not quite sure the first part of that, but let's either take you, what might be a bad example, because you had a lot of time in the C2, but how about a mid-tour lieutenant commander who spent the first half of his career in the C2? To Robert Douglas Miller's question, what are they going through to finish their career in CMV-22s?
So I'll answer the first question, then I can also give you a little background on what our Cat 1s are doing out of Pensacola, just so they can understand. But for a fleet aviator that's transitioning to the CMV, they don't have to go back and retrain in anything. It really doesn't matter whether they come from a helicopter background or a fixed wing background. You go right to training in the V-22.
Okay.
Now we have a fleet replacement squadron in San Diego that started training VRM-50. So our pilots come to VRM-50 here in San Diego, and they jump right in the fleet aircraft, and well, first the simulator obviously, but then they go to the aircraft, and there's really no requirement to fly a training aircraft before that. So the transition is really just explaining the differences. There's a whole aerodynamics lecture for tilt rotors that's a lot more in depth than what I ever got in fixed wing, and it's even more in depth from what I'm told from that the helicopter folks get. So it's just understanding the different flight regimes thoroughly before you get in the plane, and you have to be able to have that switch in your brain installed that I described as a tilt rotor pilot, and you have to be able to think at all times: am I more of a fixed wing aircraft right now, and then I do these control inputs, and then when I switch to a tilt rotor aircraft, I do completely opposite inputs. So that's a really big, that's the biggest transition for everybody, is being able to have the situational awareness to know what's going on, and your scan pattern changes, what you're looking at in the cockpit. The software switches over and gives you different displays. So you really have to understand, what you're doing. I guess it would be a kind to, when you're flying around the ship in a fixed wing aircraft, and then you're getting forward on the mission, and you transition to okay, now I'm executing the attack, and employing weapons. It's a whole different bunch of pages and a whole different sort of thought pattern that's going on in your head. It's very similar to that.
Okay. So you're almost not compartmentalizing, but it's, like you said, right? When I was out in my F-18, I was thinking about my mission, but man, when that was over, if it was a night landing, I started thinking about that right away. Right. And so it's just a function of whatever you're doing next.
Yeah, and I think naval aviators, whatever we're flying, that's what makes us unique, is I think our ability to compartmentalize and be able to multitask and adapt to those kind of things is really, really impressive.
Okay. Niels Hansen says, as a career soldier, which he is, I'm a firm believer in simple, reliable, replicable. The Osprey is an extremely complicated machine. What differences are anticipated in operational readiness rates versus the Greyhound? And he's got a couple extra questions. What is the comparison of these rates between a newer but more complicated aircraft versus a simpler but older platform? And again, I think he's drawing the comparison between the two, because they haven't been making Greyhounds, for a long time.
Yeah, the last one went off the line in like 82.
But you're still taking delivery.
Correct.
Of new Ospreys. So you said earlier that it was a bit more maintenance, and I didn't ask you, but I was thinking to myself, the complexity, I would assume, of the tilt pods, I think Sweet Pea called them. But, right, so this is a bit more of a complicated aircraft than the C2.
So our, our nacelles, the engines, I mean, it's a phenomenal feat of engineering if you think about it. Most fixed-wing aircraft, when you're pumping hydraulics through and oil through an engine, it only does it, in the horizontal plane. Well, now, take that engine and move it vertically. Just think about all the, the scavenge pumps that are required to keep the same pressure to all the components in the vertical mode too. So just that alone, the aircraft is much more complex. And so with that comes intensive maintenance. That's true of most modern aircraft, though, in the fleet. The F-35 is a Gen 5 aircraft. We're more of a Gen 4 aircraft. The C-2 is simpler to maintain in some ways, like an older car. There's not as many computers, but I will say that the C2, when you break something, the part's not always available because it's an older airframe. You know, it really is kind of the luck of the draw when you're on deployment. Do you have a particular airplane that is a troublemaker and you have to work on it a lot? So we run into those kind of issues all the time. But I will say the operational availability of the first 2 detachments is what we expected. Generally speaking, it was around 67%, which is roughly 2 aircraft available out of 3 at any given time.
Okay.
When we had major maintenance to do, though, the aircraft would be away for maintenance longer typically than a C2. So that's why we had the 3rd aircraft.
Gotcha.
And it mitigates our operational availability because that's really what it's about. The CAGs don't care. In the end, they just want their stuff to show up when it's supposed to show up, and that's what I'm here for. You know.
Yeah.
In the end, it's like that's what you're paid to do your mission. So that's why we threw an extra aircraft at the problem.
All right. Next is from John Clark, no relation to Jake Clark, I assume. Will the COD mission expand to amphibious assault ships with the vertical takeoff and landing capabilities of the CMV-22B? You already said you've made some runs.
We're already doing that.
Yeah.
We, in fact, one of the flexible options we had is one of our aircraft got stuck in Japan on the Abe Lincoln debt due to a prop rotor gearbox change. So it got left behind by the carrier.
Oh.
So what I did was we actually flew a bird from San Diego aboard USS Essex and went out to RIMPAC and put that aircraft back in the fight for RIMPAC. And so right there, we're going aboard other ships. We're seeing increased tasking from the expeditionary strike groups, and so I think that's something we'll naturally expand to. But again, as a Commodore, I want to see more aircraft and more people to support that mission.
Yeah. All right. Jason Spears says, what is the training syllabus? Now, we've touched on this a little bit, but he goes on, do they get rotor trained first and then the Osprey, which you said no, but...
so actually, that's a, not to just with if he's speaking to the initial training down in Pensacola, they do get, if you're a brand new aviator, you go to both rotary and fixed wing training.
Yeah, so I sort of abused his question here, but so let's just, for the sake of simplicity, for someone coming out of flight school or going into flight school, let's say, probably they start with the T6. I think everyone does now, at least in the Navy. Then where do they go after that if they're going to ultimately end up an Osprey pilot?
So this is where we look to save a little money. So based on where they do their primary training, if it's in Pensacola or Corpus Christi, they go to the next intermediate stage in that same location before they PCS.
Oh.
So before they change their station. So so if they're in Pensacola, they'll go to North Whiting and do a helicopter syllabus, and then they'll go to Corpus and do the multi-engine King Air syllabus and get winged. If they get primary in Corpus, then they'll do multi-engine in the King Air and then transition up to North Whiting and finish off in helicopters. So you can get winged out of either one. It just depends on where you started. There's no culmination carrier qual event like I had or you had. But they have to have both, and that's to give them the background in both.
Has anyone looked at the order they receive it to see if that makes a difference in performance?
We haven't got any data to support that it would really changes the performance. I think each one is kind of I won't say stovepipe, but they both build on each other in different ways.
Right.
So I think that naturally somebody would be better at instrument flying when they show up from Corpus Christi to North Whiting because they've had continuity in training and going to the T-44, which is an extremely instrument intensive training. Whereas in North Whiting they still do a lot of instruments, but not to the degree that they do in. So there may be something there, but not to the degree of inhibiting actual overall graduation rates or anything.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I think we answered the last question from Scott Manning. Does the COD mission of the CMV-22 differ in any way from the C2? I think we talked about that towards the beginning.
Yeah, it fundamentally changes how the strike group does logistics in that we land whether we come in like a fixed wing or not, at the end we land like a helicopter. So it changes the way that we move things around the flight deck. It changes the way that supply officers have to prioritize our logistics because we have less volume. So we need to make sure that it's really high priority if it's coming out with us. Sometimes toilet paper is super high pri if you're flying in and out of Thailand. But in general, we're trying to focus on the high priority passengers, high priority parts, and that's what we're prioritizing.
So speaking of that real quick, so in my F-18, if I was carrying back some bombs that I didn't drop, let's say, I would have to manipulate my fuel to be at a certain weight when I landed. I assume the C-2 was the same. You can correct me if I'm wrong. What about the CMV-22? If you're bringing your heaviest load aboard, do you just don't worry about fuel, or?
So the nice thing about one of the redesigns that we had that I didn't cover is that we, when we designed the fuel system of the CMV, the MV, the fuel dump came out of the side of the plane, and actually it's an emergency procedure to dump gas in a legacy MV, like a Bravo MV, because it would go all over your ASE.
ASE?
So your survivability equipment, like your chaff flare and all that stuff.
Okay.
So aviation fuel going all over your chaff pods is not a good thing. So they don't dump gas unless it's an emergency. For us, ours goes out the tail, and similar to the CV, and the modern MV Charlies now did that modification too. So we actually can adjust gross weight, is what I was getting at, that allows us, if we needed to do that. However, taking off and landing in a short takeoff mode, which we can do, actually allows us to take off at max weight. So in Bahrain, for instance, the C2 would be limited by performance limited gross weight, so you'd have to light load on gas at your max cargo weight in a hot environment.
Right, in the summertime.
Yeah.
Not particularly high elevation.
Right.
But you got one of the high, hot, and heavy, right? Or
exactly. So with us, if we short take off, it actually keeps you in the really good part of the flight envelope where you can get airborne and have a safe single engine climb away speed at max weight.
So what is the future of the CMV-22? Let's start with, how many do we have now, and how many are coming, and what other modifications do you see coming?
So we have a programmer record of 48, which is, Congress has agreed to take options on 48 aircraft. Remains to be seen with budgets and things, what that levels off at. But we've taken delivery of 20 aircraft, and so they're coming to us from the Amarillo plant for Bell Boeing. They start off being built up in Philly. The fuselage, the entire fuselage, pretty much everything that's inside the wing root here is built in Philadelphia at their Ridley Park plant, and then it gets shipped down to Amarillo, Texas, and they mate the wings and the engines and prop rotors, and then they deliver them here to North Island. So we'll have we're generally getting about one a month for the foreseeable future.
Okay.
We took our first delivery in June of 2020. And then went on deployment a year later. So if you think about that, that's really what I'm just impressed to be part of the community, because those guys did a great job of deploying safely. When you think about how much time F-35, who we were married up with on deployment, they already had an operational squadron, FRS with aircraft in Lemoore, and had done all their operational tests and all that stuff. And we were actually doing operational tests during Comp 2X and still managed to deploy safely. So it was a truly just-in-time deployment.
Are you seeing some grumblings, though? That's the wrong way to put it, but you get the point, about maybe not getting the number? Like, right, they were supposed to build, 750 F-22s, and they built 175. Is there some indication that you might not get the full 48?
So I think, budgets are still remain to be seen, but I have a feeling, based on hearing some of the CNO's comments at Hook, and definitely the appetite in the fleet for logistics and some of the expanding mission sets, I think it's a very positive environment where we could end up seeing at least the program record, if not more, in the future. So we'll see.
All right.
Yeah.
How about the future for Sam Bryant? I mean, come on, you can't do this forever. I'm sure you're having a good time.
Well, I think that I've done everything I've wanted to do in the Navy, which is a pretty blessed place to be. And as I was saying, I'm having so much fun right now, still getting to fly at this point in my career, coming up on 27 years. So, if they're still paying me to fly airplanes, that's a pretty good place to be. So,
okay,
happy.
Well, if that ends, then maybe time to move on, or just see what the Navy offers you, or what's the deciding factor to stay or go? I think
that the hard part about leaving the Navy for anyone is you're constantly surrounded by meaningful work and really great people.
Yeah.
And it's hard to duplicate that anywhere in the outside the Navy. So as I look to the future and think about transitioning, that's something I would miss a lot.
Yeah.
I think part of the reason that I enjoy listening to this podcast is that you feel a real camaraderie and brotherhood that is not anywhere else.
Yeah.
So that's a hard thing to walk away from.
It is. I can tell you from the other side it is. And if you decide to go, say, to the airlines while they do good work, it's just not the same.
Yeah. And I tell that all to my junior officers as well, is that, obviously there's a lot of hiring going on, and it's a great, future in that industry. There is a trade-off though, and you don't get that same ready room aspect right. And the satisfaction of meeting the mission that you do anywhere else. Right. So, yeah.
And my last question for you is, and I'm a little nervous about this one because I've known you a long time, Sam, and I've never had the guts to ask you how someone came up with Flesh for Sam Bryant. So this makes me a little nervous.
Well, it's actually not that exciting, but it's the problem is that I often get stuck with being the details guy. Okay. So you've heard of the term flag officer bright ideas and general officer bright ideas. People have the good idea fairy.
Someone else has to go.
Someone else has to actually go do the work. And so it was pretty typical at the Pentagon where they come up with these grandiose plans, and then they look over their shoulder, because I'm always the guy sitting in the back. I'm not at the table, and say, why don't you go flesh that out. And so I put the meat on the bones of things and finish things.
Awesome. Well, you sound like you're the right guy for the job, and so I want to thank you for your service to this country and obviously everything you did for the CMV-22 community. Sounds like the transition is going well. And I want to thank you for your time coming on here on the Fighter Pilot Podcast. This was a lot of fun, Sam.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, you're welcome.